What's up, everybody, and welcome to the very first episode of the Mastering Miles podcast powered by Bioendurance, PT, and Performance. My name is Matt Ferlindis, and I am a physical therapist and triathlon coach in the Milwaukee area and the owner of Bioendurance, PT, and Performance. I'm very excited to bring you this podcast. We are starting this podcast off strong, and this is the first part in a three-part series about mastering the marathon. And my guest today is Coach Jack Hackett, who owns Infinity Running Company and does a lot of running coaching for athletes both in the Milwaukee area and around the country itself. So very excited to have him on today in part one to talk about what limits us specifically in a marathon. It's important that we talk about the things that limit us the most. That way we can start to control those details and control those characteristics when we actually initiate our training a little bit more. Welcome to the show and enjoy episode 1 with Coach Jack Hackett. What's up, everybody, and welcome to the very first episode of the Mastering Miles podcast. I am super honored to be joined by Jack Hackett, who is the owner of Infinity Running Company, and is a absolutely premier running coach, has coached many athletes at this distance, and many other distances for that matter. So welcome to the show, Jack, and feel free to go ahead and introduce yourself and give us a little bit of your background.
Awesome. Thank you, Matt, for having me. I appreciate it. I still don't quite feel like I'm the person to talk about mastering in some ways. I still feel young, but I know I've been doing this for over 10 years. So that goes quick. My background, ran most of my life, ran in high school, ran through college at the Division I level where I was at Marquette. I studied exercise physiology. While I was there, I actually helped teach some classes to the physical therapy students at Marquette. So anatomy and physiology, exercise testing and prescription. I've kind of loved the science of running for most of my life. And that's part of how I got into coaching, was just that natural extension. That's kind of my background as far as getting into coaching, and why I think you're having me on is that I've coached, I should probably get a number on this, but 150, 200 marathoners at this point. And I've been doing it for a little while.
That's a decent number to give you a level of expertise for sure.
It's been a lot of fun, and I'm not done yet. So
yeah, that's awesome. That's awesome. So not every episode is going to get started this way, but I feel like since this is the first one and it's Mastering Miles, I'm just going to start off this way. What is your definition of mastery, Jack?
Yeah, I wanted to pull up Webster's definition when you sent me this question, but mastery to me is, it's the pursuit of excellence. It's not necessarily perfection. Perfection is something that can happen every once in a while, but it's not sustainable. Mastery is developing the tools to control everything that you can control. That's what it means to me, at least.
Mm-hmm. I like that. That's a great definition. And really just understanding what those principles are and understanding what is in your control and trying to maximize the performance of those key individual factors is kind of what it sounds like.
Yeah, exactly.
Cool. With that, we will kind of introduce this whole series. And as we were talking, we kind of realized that if we're talking about mastering the marathon, there's just so much information to fit into one episode. So we kind of decided to split it up into 3 different parts, 3 different series. Do you want to tell us what those different parts are, Jack?
Yeah, at least the way I kind of view the marathon, and especially when we talked about how to talk about this, we kind of wanted to define the terms first of what we're doing and what we're kind of talking about with the marathon. So I think part 1 would make sense to talk through, basically what limits us in a marathon, what our threshold, what our VO2 max, these kind of things, and what holds us back from kind of true performance. Part 2, I think, would make sense to talk through, how to train for those things, how to make those limiters, less of a weakness and more of a strength. And then part 3 is all the extra little things that go into making a good marathon. It's the 1% or the 10%. but we got to talk about the 90% first.
Yeah, 100%. And I really appreciate your insight too, Jack, because when we were planning this, I was really gung-ho to be like, all right, let's just get right into the weeds. Let's talk about the training. And I appreciated you for helping me like take a step back and be like, well, we should really kind of define some things first. And I totally agree with that. Like defining those things so we understand how those things actually play a part in training, in all of the little things, in all the physiology aspects of things. So I think this is going to be a really, really good way to organize it and really lay it all out. Based off of that, to kind of understand and better define how to be better overall, like throughout that marathon distance, like you said, we need to understand what really limits us, especially physiologically. So what do you feel like are the things that limit our performance when we are trying to run a marathon over that 26.2-mile distance?
I think the three biggest things, or at least the way I view it, is it's almost like a tripod. If any one of these three things fails, the whole thing falls apart. The first piece is going to be, the overheating aspect of it. So this is part of where temperature can be so dangerous. Along with overheating, the second kind of piece is getting carbohydrates in, the fueling. So without the fuel, it's not a perfect analogy, but the car stops if you don't put enough fuel in it.
Yeah.
And then kind of the third piece to that is pacing, which plays into both of those. Because if you go faster, you burn more fuel. If you go faster, you run hotter and you overheat. So all three of those kind of things play together to make up a good marathon. If you can control those three things and the training has been good, you'll probably run a pretty good marathon.
Cool. So let's kind of split up those topics and kind of chat with them individually. We're going to start off with the heat and the temperature. And I think this past year, we were given a really good example of the Lakefront Marathon in Milwaukee, a really, really hot day for early October. And I feel like that made a lot of people take a step back and be like, okay, it's really, really hot out. I may not be able to perform as well as I really hoped that I would, and maybe not be able to get that clear PR that I hoped or whatever it may be. And so we have to kind of rein it back a little bit. So like physiologically speaking, why does heat have that effect on us? Like why, if it's really hot out on race day, why should we take that step back and be like, okay, what do we need to do to get past that? Why may not our performance be as tip top as we hope it would be?
And really comes down to a protective measurement. Our brain has something called the central governor. I was taught it as the central governator, and I can't unhear Arnold's voice. So I picture, Arnold Schwarzenegger telling our body basically like, hey, it's too dangerous. Don't keep going. When we train, we can kind of train and push against that so that it starts to realize, hey, this is somewhat safe. Like, okay, we can push it a little bit further. We can push it a little bit harder. But there is still a limit. And especially on a day like Lakefront, where it was, I think it got up to mid 80s and it was 90 some percent humidity at race start time. That was pretty brutal for a lot of athletes. And I mean, that the weekend before, same weekend, Twin Cities was canceled because it was even hotter and just as humid up there. And I genuinely think it saved a life by not doing that. Nobody thinks it's going to be them that ends up in the medical tent, but I know talking to a few people that worked the med tents at Lakefront, it was packed. People were crashing all over the place. So that heat is not something to be kind of messed with.
Yeah, and you're right. I mean, that's really, really dangerous. When our core temperatures get up above a certain level, our body systems start to shut down because we're literally kind of overcooking ourselves. And physiologically speaking, we can't perform when our core temperature gets so high up in the air. And then, like you said, our body is literally trying to protect us, and survival is the most important thing at that point, not running a PR in a marathon.
Yeah, exactly. Our bodies are very good at saving themselves. That's kind of the most core instinct that you can find. Really, even at birth, we have a lot of those instincts that are protective. So,
which is probably a very good thing because we want to stay alive, no matter what it is. So, what are overall some strategies that we can employ to reduce this effect during a race? Like, how can we let's say we're preparing for like a summer marathon or summer race. Like, how can we And what can we employ to be better and a little bit more heat resistant overall?
There's kind of two factors. There's the stuff you can do training wise in preparation, especially the weeks and the months leading into a hot race. You can do things like overdress for the run. If you in the summer train with a long sleeve or a half zip or whatever, that adds a little bit of extra stress onto your system. Or even some people will train indoors, even though it's warmer indoors and you're going to sweat and deal with the humidity. That can be a good stimulus to help deal with that heat. Also, post-exercise saunas have been proven to be a beneficial thing for heat resiliency. So you'll see like a lot of these athletes that are training for the Olympic trials. It's going to be kicking off in February in Orlando. And right now it's scheduled for a noon start time.
Oh, geez.
Pretty much every one of those athletes that has any hope of doing well there is getting in the sauna a few times a week after running. So that's kind of the first piece to it. What can we do in preparation for it? On race day, there's a few different strategies too. And especially like in a case like Lakefront this year where the humidity is so high, when we sweat, we're sweating for a reason. It's to induce this process that's an evaporative cooling. So that sweat goes to the surface, wind goes against it, and it dries, which has a cooling effect on our bodies. But when it's so humid, it just becomes not an effective cooling strategy. So our bodies aren't very smart sometimes, and it just keeps producing all that sweat, even if it's not doing us any good. So we need to, add some external cooling elements. And what I mean by that is like a, ice dipped sponge or a soaked rag or an ice pack or whatever that is. I know quite a few of the athletes that I worked with, we got plans to have people stationed to give them, cool rags and things like that to put, especially on high surface area or high blood flow areas like the neck, armpits, around the waistband, those kind of things, just to help get some kind of cooling in so we could keep that core temperature from spiking too high.
Yeah. And it's a little bit of my understanding too, like when we place ice or cool things around our neck, like you said, it's trying to cool off that blood. And a lot of that blood is heading up to the brain too. And so I think it's also a matter of giving that brain that optimal temperature to function at so it can take in that information and be able to change our pacing and change our effort as much as possible. And if we're cooling some of that blood flow down up to our brain, the brain's going to be able to kind of give a little bit more effort and be a little bit more happy with just our overall core and body temperature as well.
Yeah, exactly. This is a way oversimplification, but my understanding of it is that it's essentially sampling, at two places. Again, way oversimplifying it, but like there's that core temperature, but then there's also what our brain and our head is experiencing as well. So yeah, I would definitely agree with that.
And you can see this, in action by a lot of the pros. I follow a lot of triathlon, and especially when you're talking about Ironman World Championship in Kona, Hawaii. Of course, it's always going to be hot at that race. And the two areas that the athletes always put ice in is around their neck or in their hats to kind of cool down their kind of brain area. And then a lot of them are also putting ice packs down their racing kits as well to kind of cool down that core temperature as well. So it's cool to see that a lot of the athletes who are very in tune to science and what's going to help them perform at their absolute best are using those same exact strategies.
I've seen it in running quite a bit, but like Nike, for example, makes a cooling vest that I've seen, Galen Rupp, who's an Olympic silver medalist, wearing that before going out. Like you think, oh, I need to warm up for my event. And like he's still warming up, but he's keeping his core temperature low while warming up his muscles and the ligaments and tendons and getting his body ready to perform while keeping that core temperature from spiking.
Yeah. And it's interesting that you say that. So like leading up to this episode, I was doing a little bit of research and I found like a really nice study, meta-analysis. I believe it's done by Aladad et al. And it's all about like, efficacy of heat mitigation strategies. And really the number one strategy that they said was our aerobic fitness. So how our training is. And I think that's really interesting too, because if we're better trained in those heat, we're of course going to be able to manage those conditions a little bit better. And if it's something where we're not used to that, our body is going to get into that environment or get into that area, and it's not going to know quite how to react. So our body has to almost adapt to those types of environments and things of that nature.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. Like we talked about, first step is to train and prepare for it.
Mm-hmm.
And that we got to teach that central governor to be like, hey, it's okay. I've been here before. We've been
Mm-hmm.
warm. We'll survive it.
Mm-hmm.
That makes a lot of sense. But
Yeah.
that's a great study,
Mm-hmm.
or a great meta-analysis, I should say.
Yeah. And the other thing too is another thing that was really effective for them was like pre-exercise cooling. Kind of like you said, the athletes are warming up, but they're trying to employ as many cooling strategies as they can while warming up. So you're kind of starting at that lower level. And so that central governor can be, oh, okay, it's okay. I have some room to actually increase temperature a little bit, and I'm going to be okay. That way we can squeeze as much performance out of that as possible.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I like that.
Mm-hmm. All right, cool. Do you feel like that kind of closes the book on heat a little bit?
Yeah, it's a short book, I guess, but that covers at least the big kind of points to it. I guess the last piece, and we hinted at it, but is the humidity versus heat.
Yeah.
We like I said, we talked about it a little bit, especially with lakefront being so humid in those 90% humidity kind of range. The air just carries so much water that evaporative cooling isn't as effective.
Mm-hmm.
It can be 100 degrees and whatever 10% humidity, and sweat is going to be a really effective kind of cooling strategy then,
Mm-hmm.
or a lot more effective. So that's a kind of important piece to look at, is what's called wet bulb temperature, which is basically a combination of the heat and humidity.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I don't really know that I'm adding anything of value there, just to keep that in mind, that that plays a role in how hot your body is going to get, or like how that core temperature is going to respond to the environment. Like there can be a pretty big difference when humidity is present and not.
Mm-hmm. And I think all of us runners have kind of been there, where we head out for a training run on a really hot and humid day, and we can just feel like we just don't have the energy, or we like are feeling like we're putting a lot of effort into running, and we're just not running, the same paces or anything like that. And I think that's a really, really good example. And sometimes the dry heat is okay, but when you add that humidity, like you said, we're not able to actually evaporate anything. And so we just feel like we're in an oven almost, essentially.
Yeah, I think this just makes me think of this. The ideal race temperature, I can't remember the study offhand now, but the ideal race temperature is something like 41 degrees Fahrenheit. And, every kind of degree that we go up over that is like getting away from kind of ideal, that our bodies naturally produce heat.
Mm-hmm.
When we're exercising, we're burning energy. And they say burning because we're creating tiny little fires in our body that produce that heat. Like there's all of that, and we have to shed that heat somehow. So when the environment is cooler, it's easier to kind of shed that heat.
Mm-hmm.
It's just a little bit, I don't know, useful information when you're looking for a marathon to run your PR at. Maybe check the average start time temperature.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, that's a huge factor in it for itself. I was on a group run this morning, and we were chatting because it was a nice, cool morning here in the Milwaukee area. I think it was like 36 degrees, but like no wind. So it just felt really good. Pretty close to that ideal race temperature that you were talking about. And we were kind of talking about like our ideal temperature to run in. And I'm a little bit of an outlier because I actually really like running in the heat. I know it sounds really weird, and I don't, I know I don't perform as well in the heat, but I don't mind, kind of getting up there in temperature a little bit, because it makes me feel like I'm working a little bit harder. But yeah, you can just see that. And the majority of runners love that 40s, 50s degree, because they feel like they're the fastest and can put literally the most effort into it a little bit.
Yeah, and they can. So
yeah, physiologically they can. All right. So the next on the list is fuel and fueling. And this is something that, all runners realize when we're racing a marathon. We are at minimum racing over 2 hours of time. And so we need a source of fuel, and we need a source of nutrition during that. And there's still like a lot of debate about like around like what's the best strategy. And we're going to get into that a little bit and kind of identify what we think is based off the research is the best strategy. But first off, can you take us through like the physiology behind why fueling is so important for running in general, but also for the marathon?
Yeah, so that's a big question to get them
Yeah,
all in.
it
But
is.
uh, basically, our body needs to produce that energy to run. The simplest way to do that is with glucose. It's blood sugar, basically. Our bodies store glucose in a more complex formula called glycogen, and it stores that glycogen basically throughout our body, but usually pretty close to our muscles. It's actually one of the things when we start training, especially early on, is we get better at storing glycogen. So that's part of just training volume for a marathon is developing the ability to store more glycogen. But once we're reasonably well trained, that kind of tops off. And we don't quite have enough glycogen to get us through a full marathon. At least not, I shouldn't say that. We don't have enough glycogen to use efficiently in the time to run the full marathon. We will, go through most of it. So that's kind of one piece to the thing. There are stored fats and things like that, but the thing with fat utilization is that it is a much less efficient process. And what I mean by that is that there are just a lot more steps that our body has to go through. In the amount of time that it takes to process, 1 unit of fat, our body can go through about 50 units of carbohydrates, 50 to 100. It kind of depends, on the condition that you're looking at. So that carbohydrate is a way more efficient fuel. And when we're trying to run our best marathon, our fastest kind of marathon, we want to use the most efficient fuel possible. There's always some debate about, like, especially in the quote unquote old days, pre super shoes and pre Nikes Breaking 2, where people did a lot more like fasted runs to try and learn how to use the fat stores. But that's one of the things that that Nike Breaking 2 project found was obviously the super shoes have gotten all the headlines, but part of that process was they learned how to fuel a lot better. We used to only be able to get in 30, maybe 60 grams of carbs an hour before our stomachs would just get upset and have indigestion, have diarrhea, have upset stomach, all sorts of things. There wasn't enough Pepto in the world during a race. But yeah, thanks to like a Morton, which is a hydrogel product, you're able to get in 80 grams of carbs in one drink mix. They were able to, for Kipchoge, he was pushing 125, 130 grams an hour.
It's a lot,
which is a ton, and that's the equivalent of 6 gels an hour.
Yeah.
Sounds crazy. Can you imagine taking 1 gel every 10 minutes? For a lot of people, that's way too much. But thanks to these drink mixes and things, you're able to get those kind of carbohydrates in and not have that upset stomach. And that was one of the big breakthroughs. It was about worth as much time as the shoes were, which is, for the average person, the shoes have been worth 5 to 10 minutes, and over the course of a marathon. So we're able to get that just by fueling more now too. And I think that's a piece that's way underappreciated for a lot of people. I should put the huge caveat in that, like, I am not a dietitian or a nutritionist or anything like that, but this is based solely kind of on the peer-reviewed journals that are out there and the scientific studies and the experience of a lot of those athletes.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Neither of us are registered dietitians or anything like that, but we're kind of basing it more off a lot of the research that we've read and a lot of the research that we've kind of seen, as well as, like you said, Jack, personal experience with professionals, like watching what the professionals do, as well as seeing what works best for us, as well as our athletes and everything like that.
Yeah, exactly. It's, I think, a hugely kind of important piece to talk about how a nutrition and a dietitian can give you a lot better advice around fueling kind of in general.
Mm-hmm.
But getting those carbohydrates in is such a kind of an important piece.
Mm-hmm.
Um, we talked a little bit about the intra-fueling, but I should also kind of mention the carb loading as
Mm-hmm.
well. It's a whole different kind of process. And this is one which, if you have any kind of dietary issues, talking to a nutritionist or a dietitian makes a lot of sense. But in general, you should get, and it's going to depend on your weight. There's good calculators out there. We can even put one in the show notes, I'm sure.
Mm-hmm.
But roughly like a 3-day carb load of about 600 grams. Again, I'm basing it more off of somebody like my size, and I'm a little bit bigger. So maybe for smaller people or women, it would be a little bit less. But roughly having 3 days of 600 grams of carbs is how we can help get those glycogen stores all the way to max,
Mm-hmm.
which means that you can have a little bit less on race day.
Mm-hmm.
But that's kind of an uncomfortable amount of carbs for a lot of people.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, it makes sense that carbs are the obvious choice because, I mean, essentially our brain and our muscles run on glucose. And that's what carbohydrates are, is they're different forms of glucose. And it's the simplest kind of transition physiologically going from a carbohydrate straight to glucose versus when we're talking about using fats. It's a much more complex process that takes a longer amount of time to do. So it really makes sense that carbs, especially when we're talking about the marathon, are the obvious choice. And when we see individuals like Eliud Kipchoge, who's taking in 125 grams in order to see if we're able to break that sub-2 barrier in the marathon, it makes sense that with all the research they put into it, that is the most efficient way to go about fueling during the race.
Yeah, I think there's kind of two more points that I really want to hammer home on this, but the
Mm-hmm.
first one's more kind of knowledge based. The carbs are the only fuel source that we can use without the presence of oxygen. So
Mm-hmm.
especially when we're getting later in the race, or whatever, you're going up a hill and you're starting to breathe a little bit heavier and you're getting into oxygen debt, which really in a marathon shouldn't be a huge issue, but
Mm-hmm.
this is more important for 5Ks and 10Ks and half marathons. But the marathon, definitely, it still happens. When you're running an oxygen debt, carbs are the only fuel that you're really able to kind of burn.
Mm-hmm.
Again, you're always burning fats because you do have some oxygen, but that having those carbs in your system are going to help bridge that gap and make sure that you're able to keep performing at the highest level.
Mm-hmm.
The other kind of piece to it is that Kipchoge's 120 grams plus of carbs was a process. It took a while to get there. He took many different steps and trained with carbs.
Mm-hmm.
I kind of hinted at those fasted long runs to help develop those like fat utilization. And what the research, at least that I've seen now, indicates is that by having these high carb sessions where you're completely fueled, is that it's taking less out of you. You're able to recover faster, and you're able to perform at a higher level. So part
Mm-hmm.
of this, especially in the marathon, the boom of these 2-hour, 201, 202, 203 marathoners on the men's side, or 211 women's marathon, which is mind-blowing,
Mm-hmm.
is because they're able to train in those super shoes, which is a piece of it, but they're able to train with a lot more carbohydrate in the system. They're able to stay fresher and healthier and do more sessions than they ever have at faster paces.
Mm-hmm. So, and it's also important to note, kind of like you're saying, individuals that are running the marathon should not expect to show up on race day and then all of a sudden be able to take down 100 grams of carbs per hour during the race. So in training, we need to train our bodies to be able to handle that. Do you have any like special techniques or training principles that you use with your athletes or for yourself to help that process and to help us become a little bit more efficient at taking in those carbs?
Yeah. So, I mean, train your gut is the kind of easiest summation of it. But typically I'll start with those long runs leading up to it. You can start with maybe 30 grams an hour. And then the next time you're out, you're going for 40 and 60 and 80 until you get into that, green zone of, I just did air quotes. This is a podcast. You can't see it, but into that like good green zone of fueling. But you have to build up to it and tolerate it. And it's part of where trying different things out. I'll say, Morton has worked really well for me, and there's tons of athletes that it's worked well for. Of the couple hundred people that I've worked with for a marathon, I'd say 90% have ended up using Morton, but there's been a
Mm-hmm.
handful, one or two here or there that just hasn't sat well or worked well. So you have to find what works for you
Mm-hmm.
to be able to get those kind of carbohydrates in.
Yeah, yeah. And never show up to race day trying anything new. Just like the age-old adage of don't do anything new on race day, just because then you're asking for a little bit of a disaster with it. So we definitely, like you said, need to train that gut and train our bodies to take that in, just like we need to train ourselves to be able to tackle the whole 26.2 mile distance overall.
Yeah, I think the fueling is such an important part that isn't talked about enough. Hopefully we have talked about it enough now that people
Mm-hmm.
realize that is important. But
Mm-hmm.
uh, yeah, building up to it, being smart, slow and steady, and experimenting with what's out there so that you get to that level of kind of carbohydrate loading, and you can use those carbs in too. It's a skill to not just take them in, but to also utilize it. Your body has to learn when you have that much carb present, like our blood has to be able to transport that, our muscles have to be able to utilize it. Those are all kind of skills that our body has to develop and work on.
Mm-hmm. And some of my research kind of leading up to this too, I was kind of taking a look at some of the research more looking specifically at a high fat to kind of piece that apart and kind of understand why research is kind of saying that it doesn't work. And one of the big things that I found, and I'll share some of these studies in the show notes too, is there seems to be a decreased running economy, especially when we're working out or running at levels more than 70% of our VO2 max. And kind of like we said, there's a much longer process and more complex process to turn our fats into glucose and to turn that into carbs. So it really makes sense when we're talking about running at a very high intensity, like we would be during a marathon, that it's just not as economical to turn those fats into carbs. And it's much easier just to deliver the source right off the get-go and deliver the carbs right off the get-go instead of trying to force our bodies to make that change overall.
Yeah, I think that's an awesome kind of summation of it. And even for ultra running, I haven't seen any studies that have actually shown that high fat, low carb diet to be more effective.
Mm-hmm. I know there was like that big supernova study that they did on Olympic race walkers. And like I said, I was looking at some of those and they kind of had the same thing. Like there weren't any increases in like dramatic increases in performance. And that's what we're looking at. Like what's going to help us perform better? Like both groups, both like low carb, high carb, had increases in VO2 max because they were doing training, but there isn't anything that like stood out for that low carb, high fat group except for the decreased economy and decreased efficiency of being able to turn those fats back into glucose and kind of back into carbs. So it's really important to look at some of that stuff and realize that, yeah, it's not quite as economical overall.
If I remember right, there was like a Supernova 2 study that followed up, and then it showed like a slight inefficiency in the fat group, even compared to the carb
Mm-hmm.
group.
Yeah.
Because I think they originally said that maybe it wasn't a long enough time frame to bed in, and
Yeah.
so I think the first one was like 8 weeks, and then they went to like a 12-week or 16-week study, something like that.
I think the first one was actually let's see. It was actually 3 weeks, I believe.
Okay,
With the
yeah, and
first
then
one,
maybe
which
they
is
went to 8 weeks, or they went to a
mm-hmm,
longer time frame. I don't have it in front of me right now,
mm-hmm.
but I remember they tried that study again on a longer time frame because all the low carb, high fat people were saying, well, no, like you didn't, give us a fair shot.
Yeah, yeah.
And it showed still basically like, no, it wasn't actually any better. In fact, I
Mm-hmm,
think that over the longer period, it was actually even less efficient, if I remember right.
mm-hmm,
It's
mm-hmm.
been a while since I've read that study, but
And it's interesting too, because sometimes it just seems like there are those outliers that absolutely, swear by I do high fat, low carb. It really works for me. Look at all my race performances. And yeah, that may be true. There may be some outliers where everyone's physiology is a little bit different. But when we look at the masses and when we look at specific performance for the marathon, carbs just always kind of keep coming up. And I've even seen some of those individuals where, yeah, maybe they're really, and this is a lot in terms of like ultra races and Ironman races, a lot longer than marathons. Those athletes are still taking in carbs to help that process out a little bit and to still kind of give them a boost in that energy. So I think that speaks for itself when we're talking about distances like the marathon, that carbs seem to be king. Sometimes we can get caught up in some of those crazes, and it's important to like go back to the solid research and not necessarily the case studies or the N=1 examples, but to look at, okay, what is the research actually showing us and what is proving time and time again to be the most efficient for marathon runners overall. So
yeah, carbs are king.
Carbs are king. I like it. All right, cool. So we've talked about heat. We've talked about nutrition. The last main factor is pacing. And I think this is super important to chat about for actually when we're running the race, when we're in our training, everything like that. Like we know pacing is so important during the marathon. How exactly does pacing relate to physiology? Does it actually like relate to our lactate levels as we run and things like that, Jack?
Yeah, that's a good setup question. Yes, it definitely does. Uh, a more even pace, the less jarring on our body or on our systems then too. The analogy I can only ever picture it this way is like your foot on the gas. Like if you slam your foot to the ground or you let your foot off, the car usually doesn't respond very well. But if we can keep our foot just steadily on the gas, just slowly pushing it down over the whole course of the race, that tends to be the way to pace it. And what they've shown now too is that essentially the best pacing that you can have is roughly even with a slightly faster finish. Now, that's for a lot of these elites. For the average person, sometimes just the fact that you're running 26 miles is catching up to you and you might slow down. But I think keeping in mind that even effort the whole way through, and it's going to get harder at the end where you're emptying your tank. But having that more or less even effort the whole way through is the best kind of way to go.
Mm-hmm. And kind of a lot of my looking at a lot of this, it seems like it always kind of goes back to lactate. And I feel like lactate is a big buzzword in the endurance community right now, and people are kind of learning more about it overall. Like what exactly is like lactate and our lactate thresholds and all of those kind of things?
Yeah, this is probably one of the oldest myths in running is the lactic acid is bad for you. Like, oh, I can still feel the lactic acid a few days later. The true lactic acid is dissipated within seconds of production, and it splits into, well, that lactate, which is then kind of what we're talking about with that lactate threshold, splits into lactate and then a hydrogen ion, which is the acid kind of piece. So like that acid is somewhat harmful to the environment of that muscle cell. So if we go and get too acidic, that muscle doesn't love that environment as much, and it becomes less efficient. So that's the oversimplified kind of version of what's happening with the acidosis around the muscle.
Sure.
The lactate piece is interesting though, because lactate itself kind of plugs into the Krebs cycle and it becomes energy. So that lactate can basically be another fuel source. The issue is you need to train your body to deal with it. Honestly, we'll talk about training more, but in the second kind of piece of this series. But I am such a huge fan of doing these types of fartleks where you're inducing some of that acidosis and some of that lactate production, because we want to teach our body how to use it as a fuel source. I just don't think people realize that lactate is such a potent fuel source if we can teach our bodies how to use it. So that lactate threshold is essentially talking about the point at where our body can no longer buffer the acid, and that acid starts to build up, or that acidosis starts to kind of take over. that's kind of roughly that lactate threshold.
Cool.
Yeah, that's the most simple definition that I know.
Yeah.
I don't.
And there seems to be like different zone models. So we've all heard of like zone 2. There's a 5-zone model, there's a 7-zone model, there's a 3-zone model. But like when we look at just like the 3-zone model, there's like a zone 1, zone 2, zone 3. And it looks like the difference between zone 2 and zone 3, if we look at the upper end of that first, that dividing line is like our LT2 or our lactate threshold. And kind of like you said, that's the point where our body really starts to build up more lactate and we can't clear it quite as fast. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's 100% spot on.
Mm-hmm. And so that's more of like the really, really high intensity anaerobic efforts where the amount of oxygen that we're bringing in just is not enough to help us actually clear all of that out.
Exactly. If we tie it back to what we were talking about before, that's where you then have to burn carbs
Yeah.
because
Yeah.
you can't utilize the fat stores. I mean, that's still
Mm-hmm.
going on in the background, but
Mm-hmm.
for that extra energy production, you need those
Mm-hmm.
carbs.
And so then if we look at the dividing line between zone 1 and zone 2, that's more of our LT1 or what's kind of called the aerobic threshold. Can you describe that threshold a little bit more too?
Yeah. Also kind of corresponds very well with our respiratory threshold then as well,
Mm-hmm.
uh, which is essentially the point at which we can no longer just comfortably run. It's where our body starts to have to take more breaths. And essentially, that's to bring it back to the central governor. He starts to kind of realize, like, hey, this is getting a little bit hard. And we switch to something that's called catabolic kind of production. So our body starts to break things down, like those fat stores, like those glycogen stores. It starts to kind of gear up for exercise, and that's kind of roughly that the point where we start to produce some lactate, basically. So that's that
Mm-hmm.
LT1 is
Mm-hmm.
where that kind of production starts.
Mm-hmm. So then to kind of
My
like,
understanding of it, at least.
yeah, cool. No, that's my understanding of it as well. And so then if we like really oversimplify things, and again, this is oversimplifying. If we look at like that zone 1 below that aerobic threshold, that's kind of our like really, really easy pace. We can have a conversation with somebody because we're able to take in oxygen well enough. And we're at the point where our like respiratory breaths are not increasing to a level. And then if we kind of go past that first threshold into like a zone 2, that is kind of the point where we're at our threshold, essentially. We're breathing a little bit harder, but then we're able to deal with that lactate as well. And so we're kind of at that threshold where like, yeah, lactate is increasing a little bit, but we're also able to deal with it. So it's not getting out of hand. And then if we progress past that lactate threshold into zone 3, that's where, okay, lactate is building up. That's really, really high intensity, like running as fast as we can, and our body just can't clear that. And so we're going to develop more fatigue at that stage of the game.
Yeah. And in a marathon, you're not going to get into that zone 3 until the end, hopefully. Or
Right.
if you get into that zone 3, it's because there's a big hill, let's say
Right.
Boston with the Newton Hills. You
Yeah.
might kind of get to that zone 3, but then the goal is to be able to recover and get back into that zone 2 where you can kind of deal with it.
Cool.
And that's, I think, a training error that a lot of people make is that they don't ever get comfortable with that lactate production or
Yeah.
they're just not able to kind of deal with that. And then, as far as the pacing goes, that pace gets too hot. Might have been a good goal pace for you and you did plenty of training at that level, but now all of a sudden that pace isn't sustainable 20 miles into a run or into the race because you're going uphill. And now you're having that issue and then kind of having to, well, then you start overheating and all those kind of things that start to pull us back and hit that proverbial wall.
Yeah. So then when we that sets us up really nicely to talk about pacing. So how exactly should we pace? There's so much out there. Like we can use heart rate, we can use effort, we can use feel, we can even use like running specific power meters. But like, what is the best way to pace ourselves, both while we're training as well, especially when we are racing our marathon?
I always love this question because we try to come up with all these different tools, like you said, heart rate, whatever lactate testing, which we haven't gotten to instantaneous lactate testing yet at this point, but
Mm-hmm.
uh, I've seen people using like intramuscle EMG readings to kind of predict fatigue.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, but time and time again, at least every study that I've ever seen, RPE, which is the rating of perceived exertion, like how hard does it feel to you, ends
Mm-hmm.
up being the best kind of guide for us.
Mm-hmm.
Heart rate is not a reliable narrator for us. Over the course of a marathon, you have something that's called cardiac drift. Essentially, our heart can't produce at that same level over the course of the entire marathon, and things will drift away. It's part of what makes fatigue kind of come into effect. Uh, yeah, I'm trying to think of the simplest way to explain it, but you can think of it like that heart rate just starts to kind of rise no matter what. At the same
Mm-hmm.
level of effort, that heart rate will just start to drift upwards. So you might have that nice, neat modeling of zones, but slowly you're staying at one level, but over time, your heart just pushes you into, from that zone 2 to zone 3, and
Yeah.
all of a
Yeah.
sudden you're running into some issues.
Yeah.
Uh, yeah, this is kind of an aside, but one of my favorite anecdotes about that whole Breaking Two project, uh, when they did all the initial testing for the athletes that they were going to take, like Kipchoge wasn't the guaranteed pick. He actually had some of the worst values of VO2 max, running economy, these kind of things. I say worst. He was an Olympic silver medalist at the time, uh, behind probably the greatest distance runner of all time, Kenneth
Uh-huh.
Bekele. But anyways, he didn't have these remarkable values. But when they like when they were fresh, but when they tested them after, I think they were doing 90-minute tests. At the end of the 90 minutes, his values were the highest in the group. He
Mm-hmm.
had what is called fatigue resistance. Like he just didn't have as much fatigue or as much of that cardiac drift.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, and who knows whether that's genetic or
Mm-hmm.
training or what. But uh, yeah, anyways, that's just a fun anecdote that's
Yeah.
completely lost the plot now.
It
Uh,
it's interesting though, but I've delved into the research too, and it's just funny because we have all this technology, and our society, I feel like, is always like, okay, this technology is going to help us. But then when you actually look at the research, it's like, okay, well, how do you feel? Like, do you feel like you're working hard? Do you feel like you're not working hard? Like, it comes down to effort and literally how we internalize that effort and how we are feeling during that. And again, that goes back to the rating of perceived exertion. So when we talk about like that RPE scale, how exactly do we use that? Like what exactly is an appropriate scale for us to use to gauge that rating of perceived exertion overall?
Yeah, typically it's used like 0 to 10 is
Mm-hmm.
the most common. There's something called Borg's RPE, which was like the first version of it, which
Mm-hmm.
roughly correlated to heart rate, but
Mm-hmm.
I guess that was from 6 to 20, and that's a whole different story.
Yeah.
But we use usually the 0 to 10. Zero being, going to bed. 10 being like the hardest effort that you've ever done.
Mm-hmm.
With the marathon, by the end, you'll probably get to a 10, but you'll start, for most people, roughly at like a 6.5, and it'll kind of almost steadily climb up from there. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
I'd say the more, quote unquote, elite you are, maybe the higher up you're starting on that number,
Mm-hmm.
like a 7 or an 8, but you've trained yourself to withstand that for a lot longer.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, like I said, heart rate isn't a very reliable predictor
Mm-hmm.
for marathon performance. It's interesting because in cycling, power meters are a lot more accurate and
Mm-hmm.
have actually overtaken even RPE to some
Yeah.
extent,
Yeah.
but not in the running world yet. We're just not reliable enough
Mm-hmm.
uh, to kind of use that as a good
Mm-hmm.
gauge.
Yeah, I think the difference is too, me being a triathlete and a cycler myself, like when we're talking about cycling, like we actually have a a bike, like a machine, so to speak, to actually base that power off of a little bit versus when we're running, it's just our bodies. And so that might be a little bit of a difference as well. Like when we're on a bike, it's the pedals, it's the chain, it's all that. How much power is that outputting? So I wonder if that might be a little bit of that difference between cycling as well as running overall too.
I would buy that, especially because in running, we're damaging the physical structures that are holding everything up. Like
Yeah.
to talk about that fatigue resistance, like we beat that tendon up so that it stops being as kind of load worthy. We,
Mm-hmm.
are pounding those muscles to the point where they don't function the same as they used to. Where in cycling, you're not having the physical pounding and deterioration of the actual tissue.
Yeah.
Uh, so I think that's probably actually a lot to do with that. I hadn't really
Mm-hmm.
put it together like that until just now, but
Mm-hmm.
that makes a lot of sense.
And I'm really glad that you mentioned earlier, like being at a marathon, we should be kind of at a scale or at an RPE of like 6.5 or so. I think that's a really good number. And as I was doing some research, one thing I like to use with a lot of my patients and whatnot too, is they're like getting back into running, is I really like this scale or the study, I should say, and it's by Danta et al. And we'll include this in the show notes, but it actually like looked at what is our rating of perceived exertion on that 0 to 10 scale versus our actual lactate threshold and our LT1 and as well as our LT2. And kind of what they found was a RPE of like 4.3. And again, we're probably not getting to like the 0.3, but if we roughly put that around 4.5, kind of equates to that aerobic threshold, or that spot where if we go above that, we start to breathe harder, we start to accumulate more lactate, but we're still clearing that. And then the number that was associated with our lactate threshold was 6.5. So that's kind of right at that point at a rating of perceived exertion of 6.5 is pretty close to our lactate threshold. And that's a really good number to kind of base it on, because they found that RPE scale was pretty reliable. And when they looked at it with a number of different runners, like those scales of 4.3 and 6.5 really equated to those dividing lines between those zones, which is really interesting to actually have that kind of develop itself and show itself in actual research too.
Yeah, it always kind of blows my mind that as people, like, we're so different, so many different experiences, and then we have some of these near universal kind of things encoded into us.
Mm-hmm.
It's a whole separate philosophical
Yeah.
kind of thing, but yeah, Dante's the exercise phys equivalent of Taylor Swift.
Oh, that's awesome.
He puts out a lot of good work.
Cool.
uh, uh, but yeah, anyways, the RPE is such a reliable kind of tool, in part, to tie it to that central governor. Like, that's how hard we think we're going.
Mm-hmm.
People talk about, running's, one half mental.
Mm-hmm.
Like, that's true, but it's how that mentality perceives the physical
Mm-hmm.
symptoms that are going in. Uh, Great study that looked at, because Kipchoge's always smiling, but
Mm-hmm.
having you put a smile on your face, your brain, like, it thinks its RPE gets lower, essentially,
Mm-hmm.
oversimplifying it. But if we convince ourselves that we're having a good time, our brain just doesn't care about the pain as much. It
Mm-hmm.
lowers that RPE.
Mm-hmm.
So that kind of plays into that pacing. Yeah, yes, you might have a goal, whatever, a Boston qualifier for you, Matt. That's probably what, 305 or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
Like, that might be your time goal, but the best way to get that is to train yourself so that you can run well, now at this point, you should probably be able to run 3 hours.
Yeah.
Otherwise you're not making it.
Yeah. Yeah.
To train at that, so that effort is 6.5,
Mm-hmm.
uh, on that RPE scale, as
Mm-hmm.
opposed to just saying, oh, I need to run, whatever,
Mm-hmm.
this exact pace.
Going back, maybe, and this is just a personal anecdote, but probably going back like 10 years ago, I was running my second half marathon and I was in the starting corral, ready to go, ready to run. And there was this older gentleman in front of me. And I've remembered this to this day, and it sticks with me with every race. And he said to the person next to him, if you're not having fun, either speed up or slow down. And that's just a perfect example of like trying to have that fun and that positive mentality and based, that's bringing in the effort. Like, do you feel like you're working too hard? Do you feel like you're not working hard enough? Where do you feel like you need to be effort wise to be at that point where you feel like you're giving it your all and having a good time doing it as well?
Yeah, I think sometimes we lose sight of like the enjoyment and the social aspect of it, and the like. Yeah, if we're having fun, I'm a huge believer in this. I've seen some studies, especially around like recoverability, but that the having fun with it, like you're going to get more out of it. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, like you said, mostly most of the studies I've seen have been around like recoverability and
Mm-hmm.
like in social situations, or like
Mm-hmm.
feeling like you're part of a tribe.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, is that kind of underlying theory around it?
Mm-hmm.
But that makes a lot of sense to me. Like we want to enjoy it,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
even if it does suck and it hurts. And
Ultimately, what it comes down to is we're running for a reason. And that's because deep down, we probably enjoy it to some extent.
yeah, hopefully, most of us are a little out there, and we run to deal with our own issues. But
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, that's a part of it too. But also to kind of bring it a little bit full circle too, when we relate it back to our exertion, our rating of perceived exertion, how hard we're exerting itself. We've talked about heat, we've talked about nutrition. If it's too hot, our rating of perceived exertion is going to increase. And if we kind of run out of fuel, that also rating, that RPE and our effort level is also going to increase as well. So that has a huge basis and huge tie to all of the factors, both pacing, nutrition, as well as the overall heat too.
yeah, I think you kind of asked about pacing for a marathon, and we talked about it in like that rough kind of thing, like, oh yeah, just a 6.5. Well, on courses that undulate a whole bunch, like with a big hill in it, how do
Yeah.
you deal with that? Well, you can let effort be that guide. You might let the pace lag a little bit on that uphill while
Mm-hmm.
still running that 6.5 effort. But then on the downhill, that pace is going to, well, hopefully get faster,
Mm-hmm.
and the effort should stay roughly the same. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
so you can kind of still use that as a lodestar, as a kind of guiding light for
Yeah.
you. But like that's how you can kind of use that RPE to help pace, even on a course that changes a whole bunch.
Yeah.
Uh, some people will have different sensitivities to that too. Like I am 6'5". I'm a bigger, taller dude. Like uphills are just really hard for me. So I tend to slow down a little bit more than a lot of people on uphills, but I'm also 6'5". I make that up on the downhills. Uh, so like I kind of tweak it that way, where maybe somebody that's shorter and quicker, more fleet-footed, they don't slow down as much on the downhill or on the uphill, but they're also not going as much faster on the
Mm-hmm.
downhill. But we're probably roughly running the same effort, kind of both
Yeah.
ways.
Yeah. That's a really, really good point. And another question that kind of comes off of that, some people that may be listening may not have realized how effective RPE can really be and may want to start using it. I guess one question would be if you're a runner that is just starting to use RPE the first time, are you going to be like completely accurate with it? Or is it going to take a little bit of practice and a little bit of training while using it to kind of pinpoint those effort levels for you overall?
Yeah, I think I have yet to find somebody that has nailed it the first time. you know,
Yeah.
One of my favorite workouts is basically like a 3 minute, 2 minute, 1 minute workout, where it's 3 minutes at threshold. So basically at like a, 6 or a 7, and then 2 minutes at like a 5 or a 4, like just kind of a float run. And then 1 minute at like an 8. And you just cycle through those kind of things. Almost everyone goes out too hard that first couple of times because you're just learning what those kind of mean to you.
Hmm.
Uh, and yeah, that's just a kind of a way to cycle through things. But you start to learn those numbers pretty quick when you get your butt kicked a few times.
Hmm. Hmm.
Uh, so yeah, I think it's a learning experience to kind of understand what a 6.5 means in practice, or
Yeah.
what a 7 means.
Yeah. I mean, just like anything else, we talked about it with fueling. Practice makes perfect. So we actually have to use those strategies, understand how they affect us to become really, really efficient at it. Same thing. Don't try anything new on race day. Same goes for rating of perceived exertion. Like you should have some experience of using that in your training to really understand how those effort levels affect you and to really dial in your key effort levels overall.
Yeah, one could say you need to strive for mastery of
Yeah.
RPE.
I love
I'm
it. I
here all week.
appreciate that, Jack. That's what it all comes down to is again, and the last question I have is essentially how does all of this relate to mastery and mastering a marathon? And we have to control those factors and we have to master and practice them to the best of our ability to master that distance, master our effort, master our pace, all of those different things with that. Would you agree, or do you have a different insight on that?
I would agree. I think, at least how this kind of relates to mastery for me is that you can't compete at a high level, whatever that means to you. You can't execute at the highest level if you don't understand the kind of things that are going into it.
Mm-hmm.
We talked about, mastery to me is like learning to control the things that we can control. Well, you have to understand what those controls are. If
Yeah.
you get put into a big room with a bunch of knobs, like you put me in a television control set, like I have no clue what all the knobs are and all those
Mm-hmm.
kind of things. Like mastery is learning what each knob does and each, button. I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
This analogy is falling apart quickly, but
No, that's a great analogy because especially with RPE, you got to dial from 0 to 10. What is a 6.5? What's a 4? What's a 8? You have to dial that in. Pun not intended on that one, but you have to like figure out what that is for you and how that instrument or control really works for you. What it comes down to really.
yeah, exactly. I think that makes a ton of sense, and I think we've talked for probably just about long enough at this point.
Mm-hmm.
But part two would be then, how to train to start to learn what that four
Mm-hmm.
is, what that six is.
Yeah, 100%. So I'm definitely excited for that for sure. Before we kind of finalize here, any other last thoughts or ideas, Jack?
Yeah, there's so much to this that we haven't covered.
Yeah,
We could fill books with what we haven't covered and what we don't
yeah,
know. But
yeah,
if anyone has any questions, like I'm always open to answering them.
yeah.
Reach out to Matt or I. Like, I
Mm-hmm.
yeah,
That was my
hopefully.
next question. How can people reach you? How can people find your stuff, whether it's on social media, website, all of that kind of stuff?
Yeah, I'd say you can reach me at jack@infinityrunco.com if you ever have questions. Uh, you can go to my website, infinityrunco.com. I'm on social media. I really despise social media, but I know I have to be on it. Uh, so like on Instagram, it's at infinityrunco. You can find me there. I know I need to post more, but I'm not a happier person for having social media. So uh, I try not to be on it as
Sure.
much as I am. But yeah, anyways, you can reach out to me on any of those. That's the easy way to get a hold of me.
Cool. And especially if people are interested in talking about your coaching services, those are the best ways to reach out to you as well.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, please reach out if you're interested in coaching or having that conversation. I'm always open to the conversation. So
Cool. Awesome. Well, I appreciate it, Jack. I think we got this podcast started off on a really, really good note overall. So I appreciate your willingness to be a guest and share your insight and expertise. And we have, part 2 and 3 coming up. And so I'm excited for those and kind of spill more knowledge on all of that information as well. So thank you. I appreciate it.
yeah, of course. Hopefully, if anyone's made it this far, thanks for listening to my rambling and appreciate you, Matt, for having me on. I'm a huge believer in just sharing this knowledge. Like the smarter we can all be, the better, the sport's going to be. So appreciate you creating this kind of medium for people to get a little smarter.
Awesome. Well, I appreciate it. And with that, everyone, thanks for listening to episode 1 of the Mastering Miles podcast. More to come in the future. But as always, happy and healthy training, everyone.